Olivia and Rachel were sisters, bound by grief and a shared past, but their bond would soon be shattered by an obsession neither could control. Their stepfather, David, once a source of comfort after their mother's sudden death, had unknowingly woven a dangerous web between them, leading to a shocking betrayal that would end in murder. What started as a secret romance, twisted by jealousy and unspoken desires, would tear their family apart in ways no one could have foreseen. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Olivia and Rachel, two sisters who had lived through the heartbreak of losing their mother, were trying to rebuild their lives. Their mother had passed away suddenly, leaving behind an empty space in their hearts. The two girls, though devastated, knew they had to find a way to move forward, to honor her memory. But nothing could prepare them for the new chapter that was about to unfold. Their mother had been married to David, a quiet and reserved man who had his own children from a previous relationship. He wasn't particularly close to his stepdaughters, but he did his best to provide for them and be a stable presence in their lives. In the aftermath of their mother's death, David tried to step into a fatherly role, though it was clear that it was not an easy task for him. His presence in their lives was reliable but distant. For the girls, it was the absence of their mother that they felt most acutely, not the emotional distance that David maintained. David's decision to marry Claire, a woman with two daughters of her own, was part of his attempt to find solace and rebuild a sense of family after the loss. Olivia and Rachel were unsure of how to feel about Claire, unsure of how they would fit into this new family structure. The idea of having a new mother figure seemed strange and uncomfortable at first. It wasn't just the idea of a new parent. It was the realization that their family dynamic would be forever altered. Claire's daughters, Sarah and Lily, were younger and more adaptable to change, while Olivia and Rachel struggled with their grief and confusion. The girls tried to make the best of it, finding comfort in the idea that perhaps Claire's daughters would provide a kind of sibling relationship they hadn't known before. But while Sarah and Lily seemed to settle in without much trouble, Olivia and Rachel found it harder to adjust. They still clung to their memories of their mother, and the idea of a new, blended family was something they could not easily embrace. Despite Claire's best efforts to make them feel at home, there was an emotional distance that no amount of kind gestures could overcome. At first, the relationship between Olivia and Rachel with David was stable, even if somewhat strained. He didn't seem to be overly affectionate, but he was steady. His demeanor was calm, his presence reassuring in a way, though he was never emotionally forthcoming. He was there when they needed him, but didn't offer much more than what was necessary. For a while, this was enough. But as time went on, something in their home began to shift, something neither of the sisters could have predicted. David, once a distant but steady figure, began to show signs of a deeper involvement in the girls' lives. His efforts, at first subtle, and perhaps even well-intentioned, slowly began to change the atmosphere in the house. The girls, particularly Olivia and Rachel, found themselves growing more reliant on him, especially as they dealt with the emotional scars of losing their mother. They began to spend more time with him, seeking solace and understanding in his presence. In doing so, they unintentionally created a bond with him, a bond that would soon cross boundaries neither of them could have imagined. What started as a rebuilding effort in the aftermath of loss began to unravel in ways that no one could have predicted. The pain of losing their mother was still fresh, but now it seemed there was something else at play, something darker and more complicated. Neither of the girls could recognize it at first, But soon they would find themselves entangled in a dangerous web of emotions and desires, a web that would have far-reaching consequences. As time passed, the bond between Olivia, Rachel, and David grew increasingly complicated. What began as a simple desire for comfort and stability in the wake of their mother's death slowly morphed into something much more intense and much darker. At first it was subtle. The three of them spent more time together, with Olivia and Rachel finding themselves seeking out David's presence more often. He had always been a quiet figure in their lives, but now his calm demeanor was something they began to rely on more and more. It wasn't that he was particularly affectionate. Rather, it was his ability to listen, to offer a steady presence that felt reassuring in a world that had suddenly been turned upside down. Olivia, the older of the two sisters, was particularly drawn to him. She had always been the more sensitive, the one who felt the weight of their mother's absence most acutely. David, with his steady demeanor, provided her with a sense of stability she didn't know she was craving. He was a protector in a way that felt comforting to her, but as she spent more time with him, she began to realize that the line between dependence and something else was becoming blurred. His calm eyes and reassuring voice seemed to take on a deeper meaning, something she couldn't quite articulate but couldn't ignore either. She found herself thinking about him when he wasn't around, wondering why she felt so drawn to him in a way that was more than just familial. Rachel, on the other hand, had always been the more independent sister, yet even she began to feel the pull of David's presence. She was still struggling with the loss of their mother, but David seemed to understand that pain in a way that others didn't. He wasn't overly expressive, but there was something about the way he gave her his attention, the way he listened to her complaints and offered solutions that made her feel seen. He wasn't just a stepfather. He was the only other person who truly understood what she was going through. Yet, as she spent more time with him, Rachel too began to notice that her feelings for him were shifting. What began as simple gratitude for his support evolved into something far more complex. David, perhaps more aware of his influence than anyone realized, responded to the sisters' emotional needs in ways that were dangerously ambiguous. His attentiveness to Olivia seemed to grow stronger as time went on, and Rachel could feel herself slipping into a quiet jealousy. David never overtly encouraged these feelings, but his behavior, especially toward Olivia, left her with an unshakable sense of competition. The casual touches, the lingering gazes, the moments where David's attention was solely on Olivia, all of it did not go unnoticed by Rachel. And despite her own growing feelings toward him, she felt the sting of being left out, rejected in a way she didn't quite know how to express. The three of them, David, Olivia, and Rachel, were tangled in a web of unspoken emotions. It wasn't just the proximity or the shared grief that drew them together, it was something more dangerous. They had all become codependent on each other, but no one was willing to admit it. Olivia was too consumed by her own longing for David's attention, and Rachel was too consumed by resentment to confront what was happening. Neither sister knew how to articulate what they were feeling, and David, for his part, kept quiet about the subtle shifts in the family dynamic. But the tension was palpable. As time went on, Olivia and Rachel found themselves increasingly caught up in this emotional whirlwind. Each sister was unsure of how to navigate her growing feelings for David, and neither could truly express what was happening inside them. The lines between affection, dependency, and something far more dangerous were becoming harder to distinguish. David, though never overtly encouraging or rejecting these feelings, was becoming more deeply involved in their lives than he ever had been before. What began as a comforting relationship was now transforming into something that neither sister could control, and neither could David. The family that had been created out of grief was now being torn apart by it. The secret, unspoken bond between David and his stepdaughters was reaching a breaking point, and none of them knew how to escape it. As the weeks passed, the situation within the house began to deteriorate. Olivia and Rachel, each unknowingly drifting further from one another, found themselves lost in a tangled web of emotions and desires that neither could escape. The subtle changes in their relationship with David had escalated into something much darker, though no one, not even David himself, fully understood the implications of what was happening. What had started as an innocent emotional connection now felt like an inescapable trap. Olivia, once the more emotionally vulnerable sister, became the focal point of David's attention. He seemed to favor her more, spending hours with her, listening to her, and comforting her in ways that went beyond the role of a stepfather. His words and gestures, though always measured, began to hold a weight that was difficult for Olivia to ignore. His deep, thoughtful gazes, the way his hand would sometimes linger just a moment too long on her shoulder, sent shivers down her spine. She couldn't quite understand why she felt so drawn to him, why she had started craving his presence even when he wasn't around. It was as though an invisible force was pulling her toward him, something that wasn't simply the need for a father figure, but something much more complicated, more intimate. Rachel, on the other hand, felt an increasing sense of isolation. At first, she was too proud to acknowledge the growing tension between her and Olivia, too proud to admit that she was jealous of her sister's closeness to David. But as the days went by, it became harder to ignore the fact that Olivia was becoming the center of David's world. The more Olivia sought out his company, the more Rachel felt like an outsider in her own home. The emotional support that she had once relied on from both David and Olivia now seemed reserved for her sister. She tried to fill the void by seeking solace elsewhere, but no matter where she turned, her feelings of abandonment only deepened. The competition between the sisters grew more intense. Neither of them was willing to back down, and neither was willing to confront the unspoken tension that had taken root in their hearts. Rachel's resentment began to fester, and her thoughts grew darker. She became fixated on the idea of regaining David's attention. There were moments when she would find herself watching Olivia and David together, feeling a pit form in her stomach as she realized that in her eyes she was losing him. It was an obsession that consumed her, but one she kept buried deep inside, afraid to reveal the intensity of what she felt. David, meanwhile, seemed to be blissfully unaware of the emotional destruction he was fostering. He had become so enmeshed in the emotional needs of his stepdaughters that he couldn't see how toxic the situation had become. He believed he was simply being there for them in their time of grief, offering them the attention they needed to heal. But the lines between compassion and manipulation were blurring. He reveled in their dependence on him, though it was clear that his actions were no longer motivated by paternal care alone. His relationship with Olivia, in particular, had become disturbingly close, and though he never overtly crossed any lines, his actions were sending signals that he didn't fully understand. For Rachel, the situation reached a tipping point. Her jealousy and feelings of rejection intensified, clouding her judgment and making her see Olivia as an obstacle. The once close, bond between the sisters was now strained, marked by unspoken animosity and competition. Rachel began to withdraw, growing more distant and volatile. She stopped confiding in Olivia, and instead she began to plot in her own mind a plan to break the bond between Olivia and David, though she couldn't yet bring herself to admit how far she was willing to go. The house that had once been a refuge after their mother's death now felt suffocating. The strained dynamics were only getting worse, and what was once a faint undercurrent of discomfort between David and his stepdaughters had escalated into something far more destructive. The house was no longer a home. It was a powder keg, with each of them unknowingly playing a part in the destruction that was about to unfold. No one could have predicted that the web of emotions they had spun for months would soon entangle them in ways that would leave scars far deeper than any of them could imagine. The tension within the house reached a breaking point when Olivia finally confronted David. She couldn't hold it in any longer. The simmering feelings, the confusion, the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. She needed answers. She had grown so dependent on his presence, so enamored by the attention he gave her, that it was consuming her. But as much as she longed for his affection, she also began to realize the depth of her own confusion. It wasn't just a desire for comfort, it was something much more dangerous. David, though never overtly affectionate in a physical sense, had become a figure of solace to Olivia. She found herself thinking of him constantly, replaying moments when they had shared quiet, intimate conversations, moments when he had made her feel like she was the only person in the room. His presence was like a drug, and she couldn't get enough. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control of her emotions. The confrontation happened one evening after dinner when the house was unusually quiet. Olivia had been wrestling with her feelings for days, trying to make sense of the storm brewing inside her. She couldn't ignore it any longer, and the moment she walked into the living room and saw David sitting there, she knew it was time. She approached him slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and finally blurted out the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "What is this? What's happening between us?" David, to her surprise, didn't immediately respond. His face was unreadable, and for a long moment, he simply stared at her. His silence only made the tension heavier. Olivia's pulse raced as she waited for him to say something, anything, that could explain the strange, unsettling connection they had developed. But when he finally spoke, his words were vague, almost dismissive. "There's nothing to worry about," he said softly, his voice steady, but his eyes never meeting hers. But that wasn't enough for Olivia. The words felt hollow. She could sense that there was more beneath the surface, something unspoken. The pain of her mother's death, her grief over losing the only person who had ever truly understood her, had created a space in her heart that David had unknowingly filled. But as the lines blurred between comfort and something more, she could no longer ignore the way he had made her feel. Special, desired, and important in a way that a father figure never should. Rachel, meanwhile, had been watching from the sidelines, her emotions spiraling further. The tension between her and Olivia had been building for weeks, but she couldn't bring herself to confront her sister directly. She was too afraid of what might happen if she did. But when Olivia confronted David, something inside Rachel snapped. Her anger, jealousy, and confusion overwhelmed her, and she retreated to her room, feeling like an outsider in her own home. She couldn't understand why David seemed to favor Olivia. Why had he always given her more attention, more care? Why?
Had Olivia become the object of his affection, while Rachel was left to feel invisible?
The jealousy Rachel felt toward her sister became all-consuming, and she found herself plotting in the darkness of her mind. It was as if a switch had flipped. The deep, seething resentment she had been harboring for so long now had a focus, a target: Olivia. Rachel could no longer stand it. She could no longer live in a house where the person she had once considered her closest confidant was now the very thing standing between her and the attention she so desperately craved. Olivia had taken David from her, even if she didn't realize it. And in that moment, Rachel made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't let Olivia stand in the way any longer. That night, the house seemed eerily silent. The distance between the sisters had grown too vast to mend, and the emotions that had been bubbling under the surface for so long were about to explode. Rachel's jealousy had turned into something darker, something twisted, and Olivia had unknowingly set the stage for a tragedy she could never have anticipated. In the quiet of the house, as Olivia and David continued their conversation, Rachel, prepared for the confrontation she had been building toward. The rage that had been simmering inside her for weeks was about to reach its peak, and she no longer cared about the consequences. The family, once held together by grief, was now disintegrating, under the weight of their own twisted desires, and there was no going back. The events of that fateful night left the entire family reeling, but none more so than David. When the discovery was made, he seemed almost frozen, his entire being overcome with shock and disbelief. Olivia's lifeless body was found in her room, her once beautiful face now a haunting mask of terror. It was clear she had not seen it coming. The room was eerily silent, except for the soft echoes of Rachel's frantic breathing, as if she herself couldn't comprehend the enormity of what had just transpired. Rachel was the one who found Olivia first, but she didn't run for help. Instead, she stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at her sister's body, as the full weight of her actions began to settle in. She had never intended things to go this far. At first, her jealousy, her rage, had seemed manageable, something she could control. But now, staring at Olivia's still form, Rachel realized the irreversible truth. She had gone too far. It was only after what seemed like hours that she finally left the room, her mind racing with a mix of fear, guilt, and confusion. She didn't know what to do next. How could she fix what she had broken? David, upon discovering the scene, was immediately beside himself with grief. His eyes searched frantically for an explanation, but none came. He couldn't understand how things had gotten so out of control, how the family that had been trying to heal could be torn apart in such a violent and unexpected way. But even more troubling was the realization that Rachel's behavior was far from normal. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading for forgiveness. Instead, there was a coldness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. Something was terribly wrong. The police arrived soon after, their flashing lights casting long shadows in the darkness of the house. As the officers moved through the house, taking statements and gathering evidence, it became clear that Rachel was the prime suspect. She was the one who had been closest to Olivia in the days leading up to her death. Her jealousy had been apparent, and her emotional instability had made her a person of interest. But what truly shocked everyone was Rachel's own confession. delivered with eerie calmness in the interrogation room. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her eyes cast downward as though she were speaking more to herself than to the officers. "I just wanted him to choose me. I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't let her have him." Her words sent a chill through the room. Rachel's confession wasn't just about jealousy. It was about manipulation, about a twisted obsession that had gone unnoticed for far too long. What shocked the investigators even more was what came next. Rachel claimed that David, too, had played a role in Olivia's death, though he had never directly ordered her to kill her sister. Instead, she said, David had encouraged the tension between them. He had allowed it to build. He had fostered the feelings of competition and rivalry that had ultimately driven Rachel to violence. David's denial was vehement. He claimed he never intended for any of this to happen, that he was only trying to keep the family together. But as the evidence piled up, as his role in the emotional turmoil of the household came into sharper focus, it became clear that he had, at the very least, been negligent. He had allowed the sisters' feelings to fester, and in his obliviousness, he had become a catalyst for their destructive actions. The fact that he had not intervened sooner, that he had not recognized the danger before it was too late, weighed heavily on the investigation. As Rachel's confession spread through the community, it sent shockwaves that would be felt for years. The small town where this tragedy unfolded was left to grapple with the horrifying truth. A family torn apart not just by death, but by the destructive forces of obsession, jealousy, and manipulation. In the end, Rachel was arrested and charged with murder. But the real horror lay in the revelation that her actions had been nurtured by a toxic environment that had been allowed to fester unchecked. David's life, too, was irrevocably changed. He had lost everything: his daughters, his family, his reputation. The weight of his own guilt, whether fully deserved or not, would haunt him forever. But even more chilling was the realization that this was not the first time his actions had influenced those around him in such a devastating way. David had failed to protect his family, and in doing so had caused its destruction. The tragedy that began with the death of a mother and the fragile attempt to rebuild a family had spiraled into something unrecognizable, a nightmare of secrets, obsession, and murder. And as the story unfolded in the media, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same for the people who had once been caught in the web of what they thought was love, but had turned out to be something far more sinister.